So hi and welcome to the pilot episode of Once Upon a Time in Eastern Europe. I'm Stephen Carlson and my guest tonight is Bruce Lewis. But before I introduce Bruce, I'd like to introduce the podcast. 30 years ago, a bunch of friends got together in Budapest to launch Hungary's first independent weekly English language newspaper. This was shortly after the fall of communism. We didn't have any money and neither did anybody else. We didn't know much about business, but nobody else did either. Today, the Budapest Week is no longer in print and our group of friends is scattered around the world. It's harder to imagine a more different world. I believe it's worth remembering those times and preserving our stories, but not as an exercise in nostalgia, more as a way of understanding our world today and our relation to each other. So in one sense, this podcast really is my gift to a circle of old friends, a way for us to catch up with each other and to remember times that we shared. But it's also important for us to remember that what started as a handful of friends eventually grew into a weekly newspaper that employed full-time staff, editors, and writers. And that as a newspaper, we created culture and we provided orientation, news, and context to thousands of readers, both foreigners and Hungarians. I believe it's worth preserving the work that we created together, which is why I'm working together with my two surviving co-founders, Tibor Szendrey and Rick Bruner, to digitize the Budapest Week archives. And so another purpose of this podcast is to let people know what we're up to and to recruit our old friends and colleagues to help us collect the missing issues. We only have a partial archive of our newspaper's first 3 years. And so we need your help to fill in the blanks, the gaps. I'll have more to say about that later at the end of the show. But right now, I'd like to introduce Bruce Lewis. Bruce Lewis is an old friend of mine. He's a musician, a classically trained jazz guitarist. I believe he'll correct me if I'm wrong on that. He was my roommate at a most difficult time in my life, which is that period right after I left the newspaper, kicking and screaming. So we were introduced by a mutual friend who I will leave unnamed for now. In a sense, with this pilot episode, we're starting at the end of our story. By the time that Bruce arrived, the Budapest Week was already an institution to foreigners living in Hungary. And so, Bruce, I'd like to ask you to kind of start with the story of how you arrived in Budapest and, if possible, how the Budapest Week was a part of that experience. So over to you. Thanks. Thanks for joining us.
Well, it's probably a kind of typical story for a guy my age. I was in my mid-30s, late 30s, and I felt like I had done all I could do in the music scene that I was in. But I hesitated to sort of throw myself into a cauldron like New York or Chicago or LA or something like that. And I just really loved Europe. I wanted to experience Europe. So I got back in touch with an old friend of mine, Robert Zalek Cohen, the legendary. And he said, maybe you should come on over here. So I did. I kind of just, got a wild hair and, I had already been in Europe. I had lived in Brussels for 2 or 3 months once, quite a long time. So I kind of had a feel for it. And
okay, so you were you grew up in Kentucky. Yeah, you grew up in Kentucky.
Right. I'm Kentucky.
In Lexington, I believe. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and Lexington. And your grandfather was none other than Happy Chandler. And so you really are a Kentucky boy, born and raised. And was I right about your musical education? Were you a jazz guitarist originally?
Well, jazz was something I picked up eventually because it's a very complex art that you don't really. I don't think a musician can really just start with jazz. You have to have a lot of background, but I'm pretty much an autodidact. I'm pretty much self-taught. I'm not really classically trained, although I do, over the years, I have learned to play classical music on guitar. But as a jazz artist, I came up very organically, you know, rock and roll, and then acoustic sort of folk music. I think every Kentucky musician probably has to come to terms with bluegrass at some point. I mean, if you're a guitar player or fiddle player or mandolin player or something, but I play a little mandolin, you know, just for fun. But you have to kind of come to terms with that technical side of it, which is a real difficult. It takes years to master, and so I think once you go from rock and roll and certain Americana idioms, you know, like bluegrass and old time music, American music, then you can, and blues, especially blues. Once you put those together, suddenly jazz, you conjured up the jazz goddess, and she comes to your aid at that point. And I really started studying jazz seriously in my mid-20s, just sort of on my own. And also I worked with some really good jazz musicians. And eventually I put it all together. And but I still feel like I'm working on mastering jazz. I don't think I think it's an infinite thing. I don't think.
Oh, okay. So
anyway.
I'm going to slow you down there. You met our mutual friend Bob Cohen where? That's the other part of the story.
At Boston University in 1976.
Okay. So you went up there to study, or was it just a one-time thing?
Yeah.
Or? Yeah.
I wanted, when I was getting out of high school, I really didn't know what was going on, but I wanted to go to when I heard that in Boston, 1 out of every 4 people was a student, I thought, that's the place for me. You know, I just wanted to, there were so many colleges there that I kind of, that was sort of pitched to me by, you know, counselors in high school, you know, it might be a good place for it. So I decided to go there, and I met Bob on my second year, and it was a really fortuitous thing because I was really looking to get back into music. I had been studying philosophy and religion and all kinds of lofty things, but I really missed, and I wasn't studying music formally at that point, and I really missed the just playing guitar with somebody. And I found some people told me, hey, there's this guy up the street that plays fiddle. So we hung around and started playing some gigs, and we met some other people. We formed a little band, and we played around, you know, Boston and campus area.
Okay, so fast forward, you're in your 30s,
70s.
looking for a different way of doing things, or looking to change your life or to step out of the ordinary, whatever it was. And then your friend Bob recommended Budapest. So kind of, again, part of the story we're getting into is also the Budapest Week. So if I could ask you that, what was the Budapest Week when you arrived, the newspaper?
Well, you know, Bob was working a lot, writing a lot of articles. And so he, you know, he was saying, let me turn you on to Steve Carlson because he's got a place for you to stay and everything. And it was at that point that, you know, I kind of reconnected with Bob many years after college. Yeah. And so we hooked up again in Budapest, and right away, you know, things started clicking. We got your apartment over in the Etelater area. That's an old word for Attila.
Right.
I was told many years later, Etela, the ancient word for Attila. But anyway,
yeah,
so
actually,
that's
for those
where we
people
lived.
who don't know, that apartment was kind of the ass end of nowhere, basically. It wasn't a very fashionable part of Budapest at all.
No. And, you know,
yeah.
Right. I was thinking, you know, where's the you know, pretentious Parisian cafe society? You know, it wasn't in Etelater, definitely. But we had really some great places. Some of those little luncheonettes there where we could eat for like a quarter. That was the thing about Budapest. Budapest was really, in a way, it really was at that point a kind of Paris in the 20s, because it was a beautiful European capital, and it was so cheap for American, you know, guys. for expats. It
Hmm.
was really cheap, and so we started off right away in a kind of dream world, really. And one thing I remember was I didn't know the language very well at that point at all. But when I first drove through on the tram through Moritz Zsigmondsköter, which is a very nice square on the Buda side, the South Buda side. Uh, the word I ran into like long words like George Sukdar and things like that, and uh, I forget different Hungarian words, and it was almost
Yeah,
like there
George
was
said
I
tar
was
means
I was
pharmacy, but it's an impossibly long word.
right,
Yes.
right, things like
Yeah.
yeah, right. Then there would be some word next to that maybe, and I forget some other things right now, but you know, and I remember on the tram, the words are kind of floating, and I felt like it was some sort of dream, really, because the language, the visible language, was so foreign. But pretty soon we kind of
Actually,
got the hang of things.
one of my memories from that period was also there was a one of those scrolling signs. You know what I'm talking about? So LED kind of scrolling signs,
Yeah,
and it was over
yeah,
at
yeah.
another train station. It was over at Nyugati, and I remember I was amazed watching it the first time because almost none of the words would fit in that screen. They would sit there scrolling for a minute before they finished the words. So, yeah,
Yeah, right, exactly.
right.
Yeah,
Well, so
and
what
I
was it
could,
like for you, kind of getting? Mhm. What was
well,
it like for you, just kind of getting oriented and finding your way?
it
Hmm.
was wonderful. It was incredible, really. It wasn't. It was challenging. It was challenging because you're looking at a country boy in a provincial city in Kentucky. I had never even really used public transport before. Everybody drove, in the interior of America, everybody has you either have a nice car or a beat up car, but you got a car, and nobody rides a bus. And so, we that was a very interesting adjustment. I just remember how the city, the power of the city, even though Budapest really was a kind of teeming metropolis. It even got more and more intense as I lived there. But walking with Bob one day, I think it was one of the first times that I had ridden one of the buses, and I guess I was very sensitive to urban things like but in the smoke and the pollution and everything. The door opened and it was going whoosh, this really loud sort of sound, and I was like, God, he said, "Dad, come on, get on the bus," and pretty soon I was, I was acclimated, but and finally, for a long time, I didn't understand the streets, like the fact that the Danube goes in a sort of S shape. That means one street that's headed toward the river is pointed one way, and then another street that's headed toward the river is pointed another way. So, the river's over here. No, the river's all kinds of places. And you realize that the city was kind of laid out more like spokes in a wheel than a grid. And you're kind of like, and it was a very ancient city, and so you had to kind of get used to the feel of it. And finally, after a long time, I got that sort of picture of the city in my mind. And then, in a few years, I felt like I was a real Budapestian. So people would come up to me and ask for directions,
Hmm.
things like that. That's when you know you really are a resident, I think.
You talked a little bit, you just mentioned Paris in the 20s. And I think this is a topic that's going to come up over and over again. I think we all kind of had that image in our mind that somehow we were the Hemingways, we were the Gertrude Steins, we were this lost generation. We were, yeah, I mean, did you get caught up in that as well?
Well, yeah, I think so. Europe is coming back to Europe is an incredible sort of romantic journey in a way. I've always been fascinated with the past, probably to a fault in some ways. I think I've neglected to really pay attention to what was happening now and in the future, and sort of looking back always. And people would do that to me. I'd say I tended to wear sort of like 19th century looking clothes, even the jackets and the hat, and people would say, "Bruce, this is not the 19th century." But it felt like that to me because, you know, sitting back in the cafes, I felt like Mallarmé or somebody, you know, watching the crowds go by with my cigarette and my cappuccino or whatever, my espresso. Anyway, that's.
But you weren't the only one. You weren't the only one. I noticed also in those days,
No, of course not.
artists would wear the floppy hat and carry around the easel. They seemed like caricatures of artists, you know? And yeah, I mean, a lot of us also kind
well,
of.
You know, I had. Well, I remember you mentioning it once. I had longer hair. I had more hair, and I had sort of long hair. And Bob gave me a Transylvania bag, which was cool. You know, one of those big shoulder bags, the cloth, beautiful, from Romania, but from the, you know, Transylvanian from it. And I carried that around. You could put anything in it. You could put everything you owned in one of those things because they stretched out. You could go to the grocery store, and I can remember you saying once, "Yeah, Bruce, grab your hippie bag and, you know, meet me at such and such," you know. And that was kind of the uniform for a while. It was sort of the Transylvanian bag and jeans and a t-shirt, and it was sort of a different thing. But, you know, go ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, so what's interesting to me also is we had this kind of unique opportunity to reinvent ourselves. Frankly, as you said, it was cheap to live there if you had just come from the United States. And as an English speaker, you also had kind of a natural advantage. Everybody was going to give you the benefit of the doubt. And you had a certain mysterious cachet because you represented, you know, this Western American ideal. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I ended up, when I tried to write about it, I ended up coming like, we were the 89ers. That's what you know, and the 49ers or Paris of the 20s, because the regime really fell, the communist regime fell in 89. And that just opened the floodgates for Europeans and Americans to come over. And we all ended up meeting each other there. People, of course, I didn't know, and from all walks of life. So it became a kind of melting pot. Mm-hmm.
And you arrived, when was that? Do you remember the date?
Well, I was a little bit later than you guys.
Year?
93, May of 93. And so things had been, that was a 4 year.
I mean, from the perspective of today, that's actually the same thing, frankly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
That was, yeah. I mean, it's hard to put into words how different it was than provincial interior America. And even for a New Yorker, I think it was quite a change. Although I think, as my mother used to say, once a city gets over 2 or 3 million people, they all tend to look alike or they act alike. You know, but there's a lot of truth in that. But of course, the architecture is different. The architecture is very Parisian. I heard a guy say once, a very famous writer say, that Vienna was an imitation of Paris and Budapest was an imitation of Vienna. So Budapest was kind of an imitation of an imitation, but it still had a very classic sort of continental architectural look to it. And you could really get lost in the architecture. I mean, you just, and the bridges of Budapest. So I think I was really, it turned me into a more observant person. I think when you live in the same place and you grow up, you get a little bit complacent about seeing where you've lived in a unique way. I know there's a lot of people from Hungary who would love to spend time where I live now. They're interested in horses, or they're interested in that in kind of music that comes from that area, and things like that. But I had lived there for so long, I think I had become sort of numb to its to some of its beauty. You know, it's a very beautiful place. But okay,
How long did you end up staying in Hungary altogether?
I was there 19 years.
Wow,
Exactly. I
okay.
stayed there 19 years.
And there was a marriage as well, and 2 children, 2 boys, and they're how old now? Tell me a bit about those guys.
They are 21 and 20. Wait a minute, one will be 22 here pretty soon. Hold on a second. 25 and 22.
Okay, so Chet?
And yeah, Jack is my oldest, and he's doing well here. He's living in Lexington, and Chet is Jack is learning music. He's really gotten into music. He's into guitar. He's working for a company here that's very nice. And Chet is got a new contract, I'm told, for a professional Hungarian basketball team. And I communicate with him through Facebook and that kind of thing. But there's because of the pandemic, I can't really spend a lot of time with him. And of course, Chet's back over in Europe now. So, but I hope to get together with him again very soon.
And both your boys speak Hungarian, is that right, as well as English?
Yes. Oh, yes, fluently. And they find
Okay.
They find it very amusing.
I mean, just to be very clear.
But I think they give you the benefit of the doubt. So it is. Uh-oh, your screen is frozen there.
Are we back?
Okay, now we're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what I said is that basically your oldest is Jack, but when he goes back to Hungary, he's Jack.
Yeah, Jack.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And is there a Hungarianness about your 2 boys that you would notice? How are they different from their American peers?
Oh, wow. That's a difficult question. They're really 100% Magyar. But no, they picked up a lot of Americans. Chet was living in Los Angeles for about a year and a half or something, or more. And he was going to school at Whittier College on a basketball scholarship, but he didn't really like. He loved L.A. He didn't really like the situation he was in, not academically, but with the team. He wasn't satisfied with the team. So so he decided to turn pro and go back to Hungary. But he loved L.A. But L.A., I went out to visit him once. Boy, what a crazy place that is, huh? It's down below you a little bit.
Where I grew up was Orange County, which is just south of LA, and for us, LA was the big evil city. You know. All right.
I can see that. It's very. Wow. It's. There's nothing like it, I don't think, but I'm sure it has great things about it. But the traffic on the freeways was amazing. And my boys were helping me negotiate. We were all driving around together, and they were helping me, like, maybe a quarter of a mile before your exit, you had to start thinking about getting over 8 lanes, and they'd say, pop up. There will be an exit here coming up, okay, and it was hair raising. It really was. Yeah.
Okay, so you ended up as Papa as well. That's what my daughter calls me, as Papa, not Daddy.
Yeah. Papa.
Okay. Hey,
wait.
Let's take this back to Budapest again, if you don't mind. So, again, this is the early 90s. You're a musician. You've just arrived and you're setting yourself up and all that. And where was the first place that you gigged?
Well,
can you remember?
I went looking around. I just went around beating the pavement, and when I think about it, I remember that guitar. I carried around that guitar case forever, and I went from place to place, and finally, I ran into some. This was one of the most interesting things that ever happened in my life. I ran into a bunch of guys who were dodging conscription in the Serbian army because there was a civil war going on just a couple of 100 miles below us, and we forgot about that sometimes. But the city was full of ethnically Hungarian Serbs who were looking to find a new life in Budapest. And it was difficult for them. They weren't always accepted, even though they were ethnically Hungarian. They were from Serbia. And
yeah.
I ran into jazz musicians. Oh, you're interested in jazz? How about this guy? And they had started a little restaurant called the Black and White Pizzeria on Klaushaven. No, on Kotzfa. Excuse me.
That was your first gig? The Black and White?
That was, well, I played a few more, but that was a regular gig. That was one of the most interesting ones. Remind me, I can tell you about the Dios Jurivar Castle gig, which really was impressive. That probably was one of the first things I did.
Well,
but
so
Black and White Pizzeria was.
Okay, so the Black and White Pizzeria, this was on Akacfa utca, which is Acacia Street. That street is, by the way, my last address in Budapest. I had an apartment on that street. And also, that's also kind of the border of the old Jewish ghetto. And actually, it's also now a border of what has become one of Europe's most lively entertainment districts. So that's kind of...
Oops.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can. For about 20 seconds there, 15 seconds, your voice went out.
Oh, well, sorry, that's odd. Okay, so I was just remembering, so the Black and White, that club, walking down the stairs into the place, and there was, if I remember right, there was a giant mural of some kind with the slogan that was, "That's all jazz."
Right, exactly. No. And I think it's what it was. It took me years to figure out what they were trying to do. I thought they had confused all that jazz, which a lot of times, that was one of the sort of kitschy things that even in the United States people would do because, I can go into that another time. The image of jazz in modern culture has gone through a lot of, changes with very inaccurate portrayals of what jazz really is. But, when all that jazz, come hear a band play in our bar and experience all that jazz. So I thought that's what they were trying to say. And they were not saying it probably, but I think what they were doing was what was it, cartoon like Porky Pig and
Looney Tunes.
That's all, folks. Looney Tunes. I'm sorry. Merry Melodies too. Merry Melodies, Looney Tunes. I just got a notice there that says your internet connection is unstable, but they were trying to say that's all, folks, which that's all, folks. With Porky Pig. So they were one thing I wanted to say, Steve. The Serbian kids were really into American culture. They really, really were. And the jazz musicians, anything American. It was a little less so in Hungary. But, we often discuss that. Why is that? I think the language in Hungary was just away from English far enough to make it, the whole English thing with America, a little bit more nebulous, slightly. Although there were some really fanatic Amerofhiles in Budapest, don't get me wrong. But the Serbian kids were really tuned into this whole thing. And I hung out with them and they said, why don't you come down and maybe they looked at me as, this is an American guy, and the bar couldn't pay a band, so they just said, "Come on down on Sunday evenings and play your guitar solo." And I had very primitive equipment, and I came down there, and it started to be sort of an expat gathering point at that point, because there's this American guy playing his guitar, playing American songs, and English Brit guys would come, and German guys would come, and Italian couples, and guys and gals, what I'm trying to say. And it got to be kind of a regular Sunday night thing for about two or 3 years, and then finally it just kind of burned out. And that is now called the Old Man's Pub, which was almost like a disco for a while. I think they changed, the typical progression of a bar from a restaurant to a music jazz club to a disco. Anyway.
I don't know. Well, anyway, it'll come back, I'm sure of that. Yeah, did you say something just now?
Your voice went out again, but now it's back.
Okay, good.
Went out for about 5 seconds.
All right, okay. Hey, so here's another question for you. Maybe you remember.
You can edit this out.
Oh, I'm going to leave it in. Doesn't matter. So the Budapest week, again, back to the story of the newspaper. If you remember, there was a bitter rivalry that we had with the Budapest Sun. They started after us, and they were determined to destroy us, and we were enemies. And at certain times, actually, I remember that it seemed like, okay, you're a friend of the Sun, so I'm not going to speak to you. Did you have friends on both sides of that argument?
Yeah, I remember us mentioning that about things to talk about. I really didn't. I didn't know any Budapest Sun people. Not really. Wasn't aware. I knew about it, and I looked at it. I picked it up and read it occasionally, but I really didn't know anything about that rivalry sort of thing. I did know that there was a lot of office politics in the Budapest week, and
terribly.
and there were some very good writers working there, and American and British guys, and anyway, that's where I kind of got started in the whole thing about what journalism was. I'd never had any connection with that at all, and it really accelerated.
Hey, what you just said, I lost. I didn't catch that last bit for whatever reasons.
Well, my point was that I had no connection with journalism, hardly at all, before then, any kind of journalism thing. And I learned quite a bit just watching you guys work, how a newspaper is run and how it comes together. And it also accelerated my ability to understand what it takes to really write, period. Not an article, first of all, but just sit down and really write something coherent for somebody to read. I had sort of entertained pretentious ideas about writing, which had been pretty much confined to poetry and things like that, and song lyrics. But Budapest Week really put me out into the world of, you're going to sit down on a computer, compose 1,000-word article, and hundreds of people, if not thousands, are going to read it.
So who were the writers that you were thinking of at Budapest Week, the people that inspired you? Do you remember the names?
Well, Bob was really terrific with kind of a Garrison Keillor kind of style about life that we were all experiencing. He was really capturing a lot of the vicissitudes of getting around. And he had a column called Anthropology 101, which is what I remember Bob studying and when we were at BU. And he turned me on to a lot of that too. I became a folklorist, an amateur folklorist, down the road with music and things like that. But also Dave Rimmer had published a book, and we were all like, he actually published a book that was printed and people read it, So there was another writer, and Tom Popper was really a terrific writer and is a terrific writer. that time, and he was doing a lot of editing work, I think, with the newspaper. He got me. He sort of sat me down one day and showed me how to use a word processor. You know, I hadn't even really done that. So that was really green on that kind of thing. But so it was an incredible learning atmosphere. Plus, you've been thrown into a swimming pool, and you know it's sink or swim. You know, and you're already swimming around, flailing around, and suddenly there's this other challenge of actually learning how to be a writer.
And did you spend any time at the Budapest Week offices in those days?
Yeah, sometimes you guys were more connected to the day-to-day. I was more of a contributing writer, and so and then sometimes I'd be sitting around and somebody would say, they'd look over at me and go, "Do you know anything about this band that's playing?" "Yeah, I think I heard about that." "Why don't you write something about it?" You know, and so I started getting to be the guy that did some music things, and particularly jazz things. And and that was my passport. I could just kind of, we even made up some fake press passes. I could walk into a club. I'd walk into a club and not have to play the cover charge. I'd show American journalist, American jazz journalist. And they'd say, "Oh, come right in. Yes, yes, yes." And I would go in, no cover charges or anything, and give me a free beer maybe or something. And I would listen to the jazz band playing, and I would write something about how great they were, and usually them. And then I would go backstage and talk to the musicians. And then they found out I was a guitar player and a singer, so they'd say, "Come on and jam with us." So, you know, I got to meet all these incredible jazz musicians, much greater than any of the musicians I had ever known before. They had, you know, were just, well, I mean, you know, they were very accomplished, let me put it that way. And I was able to learn a lot about, not only when I talk about writing, then I would get into the clubs and I would say, this is what it takes to really play an impressive jazz solo. You can't just noodle around. You've got to say something, and it's got to be solid, and this guy's doing it. So, you know, when it comes time for you to play, you better have something out there, man. You know, and so I would have to go home and woodshed. You know? And so it made me a better musician. Just writing about music.
So you just mentioned that. Couple of things. First of all, let me just quick story as well. A part of what I want to do with this whole thing, by the way, is to kind of collect some of the stories. And I just remember the whole idea of being able to flash a card and get access to a club like that. The first experience I had with that was in 1988 in Poland, okay? Under communism, I was in Gdansk. And I remember that I went out to, I think it was like Gliwice. It was like one of the neighboring towns in Poland. And there was some big rock concert that me and a few friends wanted to go to. And I just remember that the line was a mile long. It was just insane. And, you know, it wasn't even a question of how much we had to pay to get into it, you know? And just in a flash of inspiration, I just walked up to the front of the crowd with my buddy. And I just dug in my wallet, and I had I think it was like a video rental card is what it was, honestly. I don't remember, but it was something really, really dumb. And I just quickly flashed it and said, "Hello, I'm from the BBC. I'm here to..." And, you know, this guy who didn't speak any English, obviously the Polish guy at the front, he's just like, "Well, I don't know." He let me in.
Right.
And honestly, you could get away with that kind of nonsense in these days, you know. So I in some ways, I really abused my privileges in those days. But you said, though,
you know,
I want to. You said.
No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
What were you going to say?
Well, no, I wanted to ask. So you mentioned.
I wanted to hear what.
Go ahead. The delay is a little bit difficult sometimes. Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's like talking to somebody on the moon or something. Well, the deeper part of that story is you realize that the Allied victory in World War II made English, this almost Garden of Eden of language in Europe. And I know French people always have been a little bit irritated at the fact that English ended up sort of surmounting, for various reasons, which were very complex, really. It would be difficult to really describe it all in a show of this nature, but English sort of got the upper hand in a way. And if you spoke English and you were an American, that was an accomplishment in itself. And people would, I got this from what was her name? I can't remember, a lady who wrote a great story about Albania, a Spanish, Isabel Fonseca's book. She mentioned that this was, an accomplishment in itself. And people used to come up to me and they say, when they noticed that I was either speaking English or speaking Hungarian poorly or something, they'd say, "Oh, where are you from? Where are you from?" United States. "Oh, congratulations." They would say, and I would like, I didn't do anything. You didn't have to do anything. You walked right into a front row seat, really. They would usher you up to a front row seat. "You're an American, you speak English. Tell us what we should do." We've in a way, we've been in a communist fog for 60 years or something. Can you maybe give us a little starting prompt what to do? And it really was that way. I think some people took advantage of that, and they carried it a little too far. But it was a heady time in early 90s, mid 90s Budapest. We rode around in cheap taxis. We ate at fancy restaurants. It was great.
Yeah, I remember at one point, and this is the early 90s, I remember that I met somebody who was working with an accounting house. I believe it must have been Anderson or Price Waterhouse or one of those. They came in the early 90s to set up operations in Budapest, like in other countries as well.
Yes.
I remember that this guy that came from England, an Englishman from Anderson or one of those companies, told me that he was earning hazard pay, if you can imagine, for being in Budapest, where everything was just amazingly cheap, where honestly you were treated like royalty for the fact that you spoke English. It's, I think that, right now we're going through a period of America first and this conservative backlash and all of this. And I think what people simply don't understand is what soft power means. America had a certain cachet in the world. And, you and I and our friends in that way were also ambassadors of that world. And I always was acutely conscious of the fact that we had so much privilege, honestly.
Yes.
We abused it, that's clear. I mean, I flashed my video card to get into rock concert.
Exactly.
Right.
Right. I wanted to talk about two things. One was the reaction of official people, like policemen and customs officials, when they found out you were American. That was always funny. And also the bullet holes on all the buildings. When I said the Allied victory earlier, people might have thought, well, God, that was so long ago. But they realized that the 56 revolution and the 1945 invasions, none of the Russians never bothered really to do much repair of the building. So we saw almost like a movie set, exactly the way it had always been.
Right.
Some things have obviously had been refurbished and renovated, but a lot of stuff not. So you walked right in. You said, I used to see a house. It may still be there. I'm not sure they ever fixed it up. It was down Dombogar Ut, I think, way over in Buda, off of Fehevari. And you went back there, and there was another side street which I'll never remember the name from, but there was a little beautiful Habsburg looking, one of those old-fashioned Hungarian houses that you almost would find in the country, but it had a porch maybe. It wasn't like a peasant house with a long long, elongated house with the big thick walls. It was more like just a house with the typical Austrian designs on it, maybe even a French fleur-de-lis pattern, on the window casings. And you know what I'm talking about. It
I
was
do know, yeah.
completely shot through with bullet holes. Not just on the outside. Somebody still lived there, but obviously there was somebody the government didn't like that lived there, and they just pounded it, and it was never repaired. And I used to walk by there quite often. I would just contemplate the ruins of the mid 20th century, which is really what it was. And I often thought that Budapest was a ruined city in a way that were built upon. And you looked back over it, the buildings were huge, and 19th century, early 20th century Europe was incredible. And then they had these two wars, which just ruined everything. But it's come back strong.
So yeah, actually, like you're saying, the city was filled with bullet holes.
Yes.
And the
and
Hungarians,
flak scars.
There wasn't any kind of deliberate policy, I am sure, but the Hungarians left those bullet holes. It was kind of, they were making a point. They didn't want to forget that. I remember,
Right.
Even the last building that I lived in, like I said, it was on Akacfa, which was the same street with the black and white. In that house, as I walked up the staircase to my apartment every day, you could see the evidence of a firefight in the staircases. There were bullet holes strafing up and down the walls of the staircase there. And also on the front of the building was a plaque that commemorated a person who was a leader of the resistance who had been kidnapped by the Russians from the building in 1945. So you always saw the evidence of history around you. But the other thing that was striking about Budapest for me was, and I lived there 25 years actually, was to see in that space of time how rapidly and profoundly the city changed visually. There was so much. So the first step was they were burning coal in the 80s, and then they stopped burning coal, and it took time, but eventually all of that mess, all of the coal stains got scrubbed from the buildings and they emerged clean. And then, the renovation of key buildings happened, and rebuilding of the streets, and all of these projects were always ongoing. But I remember I would come back to where I grew up in Southern California. All the streets looked the same. Some of the businesses hadn't changed. And I'd go back to Budapest, and it would be profoundly different. Interesting kind of perspective.
It was amazing what they did, and we got to see that whole process: the psychological level, the political level, the architectural level, everything, financial. Budapest went from an economy, a soft currency that was basically scrip, the forint. It has never been a hard currency. They still have that, unfortunately. But I don't know if it's unfortunate or not. I'm not an economist really. But but we saw the buildings and the people. What happened in '93 when I was running around Budapest in the early aughts or the mid aughts, the city had so totally changed. No one really even talked about the earlier communist situation. And the thing about Budapest, the history, let me just go back just for a second. Budapest was so unfortunate to be the sort of the east-west crossroads like that, particularly between Russia and Europe, that they were bullied by the fascists, then they were bullied by the communists. They got really a double whammy, and that was really unfortunate for them. But I think it's deep in the consciousness of the culture, what they've been through, and but back to their love of Americans, I would be carrying my guitar on a train going to a gig maybe in Croatia or Austria or Germany or Italy, and the conductor, in a former communist country would come up, the guy would always go, "You are American?" "Yeah, that's hand in your American passport." He would go, "It is Fender guitar?" So they want to know about the guitar, and my brother is in New York for 5 years now. And it was pretty soon it was like this whole family thing, and they, the American passport was like this. In fact, I even had a guy tell me once. He said, "Bruce, please, can I look at your passport?" I said, "Of course." I told him, and he would look through the American passport. Hope you can still hear me. And he was looking at it.
Okay.
And then he said, he handed it back. He goes, "That is a fine piece of paper." So, I mean, you had to.
Right.
Yeah.
I used to call my American passport my magic wand, because
Right.
I could just show that and get through any border. Of course, that's not the case today, is it?
Well,
I cannot visit
and I
my
want to
daughter
say
in
something.
Budapest. I am physically not allowed. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the conservatives can say, "Oh, well, it was the war that we fought for freedom that did that." Okay, that's not particularly true. That's misleading, because now the policies of the conservative policies have turned these people against us, not for us. Okay, so yes, you won the war. You helped win the war back in 45, but from that point on, you have squandered your relationship, because the Eastern Europeans loved us best because they had been separated from Europe and neglected, really, by not only Western Europe but the United States as well. And yet they still loved us. But now, as we, of course, their situation is different, because the fact is they are now siding with the more fascist governments, and they're not progressing as well as they were. They're not on track now with the progressive ideas that they once had. I know that's probably unclear.
To be fair, most Hungarians, quite frankly, they worshipped Ronald Reagan. Quite a lot of people, frankly, they worshipped the strong America. They felt that America opposing the communist world was part of what liberated them. And I suppose there's truth in that as well. I will give them that. But, it's like, yes, I would go to Germany and the Germans would be all fashionably leftist and anti-American. And then, of course, after ranting for a half hour, they would invite me to watch a cowboy movie and listen to their stories about their latest holiday in Florida. It was like that. Whereas the Hungarians, they had no opportunity to visit Florida, and they were just staunchly pro-America, and very often pro-Reagan and hardline Cold War policies, that kind of thing. So I'll give them that. Let's give that balance there.
No, right. Well, you can throw the baby out with the bathwater. The American, the wonderful defeat of the Axis powers was a great thing. Nobody argues with that. But then what you have to do at that point is, the Western Europeans suddenly saw that I guess what I'm trying to say, Western Europe really, in a way, was asleep until like the 90s or late 80s, and then they woke up as well, in a way, with the Reagan era, the 80s, I suppose, with the end of the Cold War, and anyway, I'll get back to that later.
Listen, I'd like to get off the subject of politics and talk more about
Yeah, of
music,
course.
if you
Of
don't
course.
mind.
Yeah, that's right.
You
Okay.
met a number of outstanding musicians in your career in Hungary. And can you name a few names? Would you like to name drop?
Oh well, um, I would say Sokchi Lakatoshvili. I didn't get to play with him much, but I got to talk to him several times, and he did some records in the United States. He got to turn some heads in the United States, even during the communists, before the regime fell. Alidar Pege, the great bass player,
Again,
he was called the
right.
Paganini of the bass, and it was through my relationship with a really great American guitarist named Larry Coryell, who was right up there with John McLaughlin and Al Di Meola. I got to open for him for a show once in Lexington, and we became friends and started corresponding. And he was really kind of amused at my knowledge of his work. And he turned me on to some of his other friends who I also knew about. But he said, "Here's his number, and you can call him up and email him or get in touch with him, and he'll tell you some bars you can play and stuff." And I came over, and he said, "Be sure when you're in Budapest to look up Alidar Pege." He had played with Pege several times in Europe, and so I did. So there was another passport into the Budapest jazz scene, and pretty soon I realized these guys are really good. So
Right.
I mean, like Herbie Hancock good. Like Chick Corea good. That kind of good. And they really were amazing to watch up close, and they were very friendly and magnanimous about helping you out and giving you pointers on what to do in Budapest. And then the younger guys, incredible piano players. Sokshi's two sons, Bela Jr. and Roby, were amazing, and they're both big names in Europe now. And also, I met the little. He was only like 19 years old when I met him. I was in my 40s, and he was playing club. Sumo Arpad, who was a really well-known player at the Thelonious Monk Institute in L.A., where he was trained further in his career. I mentioned him to some of the American embassy people, and they actually helped him, I think, get that scholarship to Berkeley when I told them about him, and some other people, Andy Shomoji, whose father was a friend of Bela Bartok's back in the day, and he helped him get a scholarship to Berkeley, and then he went from Berkeley in Boston to the Thelonious Monk Institute, and he's a fantastic piano player. Also, Pluto, Jozef, and Yoji Horvat, Barca. Everybody calls him Barca. Amazing bass players. I'd never heard guys play acoustic bass with that kind of fluidity in terms of soloing. I mean, it was like meeting somebody like Ron Carter or Jaco Pastorius, and these were young guys coming on, Christian McBride type chops, these guys had. And so that to me was my education, even though I was often older than them. I met some of the older guys too. And the Budapest jazz scene is a very venerable thing. There's not a lot of money in it, but there's a lot of great people. A lot of great people. I could probably go on and on with names. Attila Laszlo, he's a great player. Cornel Fekete Cornel. He wrote a piece that Dave Liebman, it was one of Miles Davis's closest cohorts. Dave Liebman came and played one of Cornel's pieces in Budapest. Another thing was some of these really great Jewish musicians in New York wanted to come to Budapest to kind of explore their Jewish heritage. And so we would run into people like that. Herbie Mann played at a club that I worked at. And we all hung out with him for a couple of days. And Coryell came over a couple of times. It was really a great feeling, great feeling to be able to meet these
Well, and also,
and
And you know, through our mutual friend Bob Zelig Cohen, we also got to meet
Right,
the Klezmatics,
right.
Michael
The
Alpert, I
folk
believe
scene.
his name is, and a
Glad
number
you mentioned
of
that.
yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, totally. And the thing is, you haven't even mentioned the name Lakatosh.
Yeah,
So as I
there's
remember, you know, there's yeah,
well, uh, uh, Paulie Lakatosh, a great guitarist who's now like bosom buddies with George Benson. You know, Benson's, and the thing was, this was really cool. We were walking around one night on a Cotswold. That's the center of gravity, I think. The ground zero or something of culture in Budapest and how we experienced it. But we were walking down a Cotswold one night, and there was this kid playing on his porch, and I was with a couple of guys. Stop! Wait! Stop a minute! And this guy was great. Well, it turned out he had been playing around Budapest for a long time. A lot of people knew him, but we became really good friends. He invited us up to his apartment, and we played, or we went over to our friend's house or something, and we jammed all night long. We were just, and I ended up trying to record him, but I didn't have enough money really to do it. I thought to myself, I found a possible star that I could export or maybe import to America, and I started this wheels turning in my head, but you know, you just didn't have the dough to back it up. But finally, somebody did about 10 years ago. One of some of his gypsy cohorts did a full-length album and video of him, the making of the album, everything. And I think it must have gotten in George Benson's hand, because then eventually he went to LA, and there's his pictures all over his Facebook page of him and George Benson, you know, just like, and George Benson talking about how great he is and everything. And so, you know, I got to hang out with these guys, and
right.
they gave me a lot of interesting perspective on the whole music scene. But yeah, Bob turned me on to the Hungarian folk scene, and there was Ökes Csaba, Ökes Csaba. I think
I
I'm
do
pronouncing
remember
it,
him.
who
Ök,
died
yeah,
recently.
was it
Yeah, and remember
Ökrish or
him? He
Ökish?
was
I
an
don't remember. Yeah, yeah.
amazing player. Yeah, and some other people like that. Unfortunately, he passed away a while back. But we hung, man, one night, I remember in the summer, you'd be drinking with friends around 11 o'clock and getting into it and talking about music. And maybe even the dude had his violin, and you might even have your guitar, and you'd be right there at the cafe. And in Budapest, they didn't come over like an American and go, "What the hell are you doing here? You're disturbing my customers." You know, nobody did that. They loved it. You know, if you just
Right.
started playing impromptu, you didn't have to make a big excuse about it. You know, and and it would be like the bar would be open till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and we'd be sitting there playing and talking, and then other people would come and musicians would straggle in from their gig, and we'd be jamming. Well, all of a sudden, you know, and Urkesh Chava said, "Come over to my apartment." So I went over there, and he really just explained. English was not great, but he explained the whole music scene to me, and he talked about how Bob Cohen had helped him so much when he went to America on his tours, and also about, before you knew it, the birds were chirping outside, and you
Right.
open up a window, and it was dawn at like 4:30 or 5, because you know you're a little bit north in Europe, and it's like being in Holland or something almost, you know, where it's 10 o'clock at night, and then by 3 a.m. it's light again, you know, in the summer, in the midsummer. And that was the way it was. And that was interesting, because sometimes you would take a bus back, particularly on Saturday. If it was a Friday night, you'd take a bus back to your apartment, or public transport, one of the beautiful trams. I love the trams of Budapest. And you take the trams, and there would be guys working, going to their shift on Saturday morning at 5 a.m. And you're still in your gig clothes, and you're about half crocked, you know, or you're really tired or anything. And you're sitting there, and people are looking at you in the bus like, "You're not working. I'm going to work. What are you wasting your life with this bullshit?" And so you would actually meet people on their way to work, you know, and it would and that was fun. That was fun though. Yeah. And you would feel
Oh
like
yeah, very much.
you had really experienced a day, you know, like from we would musicians, we'd sleep in the morning, but we would spend the whole day playing or doing something with music and meeting with writers,
Well,
doing articles.
let's give it a chance. Just a second. Hey, Bruce, are you there? Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I think things cut out. So in the early 90s, as I said, people had a lot more time for each other. And, you know, there was a lot more kind of random connections that I remember. You just end up, you know, walking down the street, you hear music playing from some window, and you end up, you know, joining a party, meeting somebody, and then going off somewhere else. That kind of thing seemed to happen to me. So
Uh-huh.
I wanted to ask you, if you don't mind, just to mention a few more of the venues that you used to play, just to see if any of us remember any of those things. The Black and White on Akatsvautsa, certainly. Anywhere else that you want to mention?
Any other clubs? Well, one thing
Sure.
this isn't a club, but one thing uh, um, Robert Zalick Cohen, the legendary, turned me on to some bigger concert promoters. And one of my most memorable gigs was going to Dios Juriva outside of Miskolc, which was an 11th century or 12th century, give or take a
Right.
couple of centuries, hunting castle for nobles in that period. You know, this we're talking, you know, a couple hundred years after Hungary was discovered. So these are like, and
Okay,
it
so
was
this is
destroyed,
in the
as you know,
east of the
historically.
country. Mhm.
Right,
In the east of the country,
right.
this is a much more, much
Northeast,
less
I think,
prosperous,
up by
yeah, much less prosperous area of Hungary. So a lot more unemployment.
yes,
People even have more time on their hands. Yeah, go ahead. And
yes.
this is again the early
Well,
90s, you're saying?
yeah, very
Yeah.
very poor. Yeah, this is like 90, summer of 93, 94, somewhere. And Miskolc
Mm.
had, and also the city of Ózd nearby, had been very big steel producing towns, but then that whole market just disappeared, and there was a lot of poverty and a lot of you know, instability of what people were going to do, and a lot of people on welfare and things. And but I got to play in this place, and they set up the stage inside the old castle. And you know, I've never played a place like, I was just like, wow, I've never played anything like this. So I got up and did my shtick in my solo act, and some very nice people. And I remember, just briefly, I remember I was walking around carrying my artist badge on, and some people said, please come here. You know, can you give us your badge so we can get in? They didn't have money to get into the concert. So it was an outdoor concert. So I handed them my badge over the fence. They would walk down to the entrance, they'd put it on, walk down the entrance and come in using my badge. And then they'd give it back to me, and then I'd give it to somebody else. And so their whole little entourage of Ózd people got to visit, got to see the show. And they became fast friends. And of course they said, please come and visit us. And the thing is, I took them up on it because I you know, I wanted to see that part of Hungary. And they treated me like a king, and they fixed meals for me and everything like that. And even one guy was an astronomy buff, and they had an observatory on a hillside. That was kind of a more mountainous part of Hungary. They had a sort of a small observatory, and they had an astronomy club meeting every now and then, and they would all sit around, and they turn on the telescope and look around, and they said, could you come by and, you know, during the breaks while we're having a little something to eat, play some blues. So I was like playing blues at an astronomy club meeting, and I thought that was really something, you know. And they were really nice people. In fact, I'm still in touch with some of them today. Well, one thing is,
Well, you know,
I'm told
oh,
that I need to wrap it up. So,
okay,
so
all right then.
I hope we can do it
Does that
again.
mean that you still have? Okay, so that's it. You're going to finish now. That's the thing. Okay. Did you have time for one more story, though? The story of the great fireworks? You don't?
Well, yeah, okay. I was playing for uh, a really great, very popular band called the Cool Miners, a very popular dance band, and they worked everywhere. I saw some really beautiful architectural places where they would have gigs, you know, up on the Castle Hill, they private parties that were just so posh and amazing. And some of the talent in that band was just off the tracks. And I really learned a lot playing with them as well. They played on big stages, not a lot like people were really listening that carefully, but you were out there and you had to kind of perform. And and that was really great experience for me at that time, even though this was, you know, I'm kind of approaching 50 years old or more. And some of the guys in that band were really great. But one night we played on a ship in the Danube, and that was in 2006, August 20th. And I've written about it. It was a terrible storm came down and swept across the Danube uh, after a wonderful period of calm right before that, where both sides of the Danube were lined with thousands of people. Thousands.
Okay.
I forget how many
So
people they said, but it was in the tens of thousands.
this is the national holiday, St. Stephen's Day. This kind of marks
Right.
the end of
Right.
summer. It takes place on August 20th. And actually, it's not tens of thousands of people, something like 1 million people lining the banks of the Danube on both sides. It's a
Wow.
huge crowd, actually. It comes from the
Wow.
countryside to Budapest. And the whole highlight of this holiday commemoration is the fireworks. They have firing stations up and down the Danube. So, and then you are on a boat, as I recall,
Right.
playing
A very
this gig. Is
large,
that right?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Okay.
very large one of those river cruiser things, but it's parked on the side of the bank. And we're playing a private party for a big Raiffeisen bank, I think, and very, you know, evening dress and everything. Well, we took a break and people went up on top of the boat that was open, and the fireworks were right next to on the uh, Sabach Green Bridge, which they refurbished while I lived there. It was just beautiful. And what they did, they restored it to its former glory. And it's really worth seeing if you go to Budapest. But we were right under that bridge, park, and the fireworks were going off right beside us. Well, they only lasted about a minute before the storm just swept down. Maybe the fireworks angered the gods of the thunder gods, but the storm came right down over us. And I think you were there somewhere on the riverside that night, and it really hit the top of that boat really hard. I think our some of the smaller boats, the whole river was full of little boats and big boats, stationary.
Right.
Well, the storm and the wind smashed a couple of boats, smaller boats, into us, and people died, drowned. I think there was 5 or 6, 8 people who died, and 500 people were injured. It was August 20th, 2006, and I managed to finally,
2006.
yeah, we finally managed to get back under the uh, into the boat, the glassed in part of the boat, which was still secure. And we went ahead and played after the storm went away after about an hour.
Wow.
And we
Wow.
played, we kept on playing. And then when I finally got home, I turned on CNN and it was being reported on the news right there. And it was
Right.
about 90-mile-an-hour winds came down off Gellert Hill and just swept
Mm.
with just cauldron buckets of rain. And it just swept
Right.
through in a very, almost like a flash flood or a tornado. I thought maybe it was a tornado. But anyway, that's my
Right.
story. And I have to leave it there,
Well,
Steve, but I got to go.
okay. It's good
I'll,
to hear from you. Thank you for
Yeah.
your time, Bruce. It's really good. I'm just, in wrapping this all up here, I'm just going to say that I'm going to be continuing the podcast on a weekly basis. That's the plan. And we're working to put together the archives for the
Yes.
Budapest week. So I will leave a link in this description below so that people can find that page, check and see if they happen to have a missing copy or two that they can help us out with. Bruce, thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, my
Bubble
dear
Bruce.
friend. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
All right,
and,
then.
and I'd love to do it again. It's just an endless, it's almost infinite what you can just keep talking about, all the experiences. It was really, I call it the centerpiece of my life. Really, Budapest was a wonderful city. And I hope to come back and visit again sometime for a long time. And,
Okay, good. Well, we'll leave it at that
Right.
then. Very good. Thanks, Bruce.